The following program is presented to you by the New York State School Boards Association.
Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Institutional Racism, Raising Awareness and Meeting the Needs of All Students. This is part 2 of NYSSBA's Equity and Inclusivity webinar series. We'd like to begin by thanking the Utica National Insurance Group for their sponsorship of today's webinar. Utica National has been insuring public schools in New York State for over 45 years and is proud to support New York State School Boards Association. Today, we will define what institutional racism is and what it looks like, and we will discuss how implicit bias impacts an educational system. We will also look at ways to identify if these systemic problems exist within a district and offer suggestions of how school boards can educate themselves as they work to reduce and eradicate institutional racism from their districts. My name is Darcy Dercoli, Director of Leadership Development here at the New York State School Boards Association. I will be moderating today's conversation along with my colleague, Mark Schneider, NYSSBA's Leadership Development Manager. Good afternoon, Mark.
Good afternoon, Darcy. I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Mark and I are joined today by 3 special guests. Our first guest was born and raised in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, Dr. Anael Alston. Dr. A is currently the Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Access, Equity, and Community Engagement at the New York State Education Department. In this capacity, he informs educational policy across the state and administers over $200 million to help support students across New York State from pre-kindergarten through college. Prior to that, he was the superintendent of schools for the Hamilton Central School District with exemplary accomplishments such as reaching a 100% graduation rate, among others. But most importantly, Dr. A distinguishes himself as a student's first instructional leader. Welcome, Dr. Alston.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me, Darcy and Mark.
Thank you. Also joining us today is Dr. James Montesano. Dr. Montesano is completing his 10th year as the superintendent of Nyack Public Schools. Prior to coming to Nyack, he served as superintendent of schools for 12 years for the Paramus and Dumont Public Schools. During his 43 years in public education, he has also served as assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction, school principal, and assistant principal, as well as a classroom teacher. Dr. Montesano taught for 16 years at the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers University and Caldwell University. And interestingly, Jim's father and 3 brothers also served as superintendents of schools too. So welcome, Dr. Montesano.
Thank you very much, Darcy and Mark. We're honored on behalf of the Nyack School District to be here with you.
Great. And lastly, but not least, I'd like to welcome Karen Hughes. Karen is a senior executive with wide-ranging information technology experience in the global financial services arena, providing business and technology solutions across all facets of financial services. She has managed diverse global technology teams across multiple continents throughout her career and partners with senior business management in providing long-term strategic solutions to business problems. Karen is a UK native, but currently calls Nyack her home, where she has lived for 22 years. She is currently a trustee on the Nyack School Board since 2012 and has served as president for 4 years during that time. She has 2 children, a Nyack High School senior and a Nyack graduate who is a senior in college. She is currently president of the Inspire Nyack Foundation, which funds STEM initiatives in Nyack schools through fundraising and sponsorship initiatives. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you very much, Darcy. Thank you, Mark.
Great to have you all with us. So, many of us are aware of recent news cycles where you may have heard our civil rights leaders and advocates demanding an end to systemic racism. Systemic and institutional racism exists throughout our society, and it matters. Not even our schools can escape the threads of our history here in America, whether they are public or private schools, large or small, multicultural or monocultural. As many of our experts on this subject would agree, the subtleties of racism can be seen at all levels of education, from the classroom to the administration or even at the district level. It can affect almost every aspect of the K through 12 educational experience. And institutional racism can be hard to spot. It demands strategies and crucial conversations to bring it out into the light. So Mark, why don't you get us started in this conversation with our first question for our panelists?
Thank you, Darcy. And as you stated, institutional racism is a societal problem, not just an educational issue. But there are some in our society that tend to politicize the issue or even deny that it exists. So as we begin today's discussion, let's start with a clear understanding about what institutional racism is and what it looks like. And Dr. Alston, let me start by asking you, what is institutional racism? And is there evidence to prove that it really is a problem in today's society? And most importantly for us, a problem in our schools?
Well, that's a power pack compound question, and thank you for having me. And before I respond, I think it's important to put this in context. The context is we are in the midst of a global pandemic, right? So there's some tension to begin with. Additionally, there's a heightened sensitivity to racial and social justice that was sparked by the latest inflammation, the killing of George Floyd that many people saw over and over again, all right, which sparked worldwide protest. And compound that contextual piece with we're in a time and space where thought, logic, critical thinking are often being replaced with one's personal opinion or worldview in spite of facts and evidence to the contrary. Okay, so you asked the question, what is institutional racism? Well, I would break it down before we get to institutional racism. What is in fact racism, right? And according to the Anti-Defamation League, or you can Google it, or the solid answer is, according to the ADL, as racism is the marginalization or oppression of people of color based on a socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people. Okay. Another way is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is in a minority or marginalized. Okay, so now institutional racism, according to Oxford, racial discrimination that has become established as normal behavior within a society, so that the impact of such behaviors have obviously racial implications. So what might be examples? And there are several. And again, I'll use one that comes out: disproportionality in a job market or wealth distribution, incarceration rates, etc. So an example, and I'll get to education, and in fact, I'll start with it. How is it that wherever you go, you have school districts that have very, very few, if any, African Americans or Hispanic professional teachers, right? Now, Now, I just want to say, I have been a board member, publicly elected board member. So I understand the dynamic. I also have been a superintendent, so I understand. However, in one district, you can have virtually all white staff, and 6 miles down the road, you have a much more diverse teaching pool, right? In one, or because right now I'm physically on Long Island, you can start your career in the city if you're white and easily make the transition to a suburban Long Island school district. Not so easy for people of color. And so typically what we hear is, well, most qualified. By what standard? By what standard is most qualified? And when we talk about social networks, you know, if board member so-and-so knows the position is open and they, you know, let so-and-so know, that's inside connection. So if you're not in part of the preferred group, you're on the out. So that's an example. Another example, which I'll share, which is personal, right? Because I'm very clear, and this might be an uncomfortable conversation, right? Because there's creative tension here, right? And we want this conversation to have creative tension and not emotional tension, because we can actually move in creative tension. I am an Ivy League educated professional, right? And I know, as it relates to racial profiling, firsthand experience. See, I know that an Ivy League educated white male with my income level typically doesn't have guns drawn on him on traffic stops. Right? I just know that to be true. Remember, we talked about facts and evidence, not just one's own worldview. And so I have to ask myself the question, what is that about? If nobody else, you're right, that just typically doesn't happen. And so I do want to say institutional racism is real, and there are things that we can do and we will do in this conversation with my colleagues to help unpack it and hopefully to add value to the board members here and who they share with on things they can do to combat it. We know that this is a warm audience because every board member took an oath, right? And in a world that might be a little bit strained, I still believe that when people take an oath for something, they believe in it. And people have taken an oath to do the right thing by children. And institutional racism can't be good for all children, if all means all. Back to you, Darcy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alliston. Superintendent Montesano or Karen Hughes, you know, give us a little bit of perspective from your place where you sit about institutional racism and how you might also see it play out.
Yeah, maybe I'll just start. And I think Nyack is a great place to focus in on. And those of you that are not familiar with Nyack, we're unique in a number of ways. First of all, if you just look at our student enrollment, the makeup of the Nyack schools, we're almost an exact microcosm of the state at large of New York State. We're probably about 44% white. We're about another 26% Hispanic Latino. Our Black African American population hovers around 19–20%, maybe another 7 or 8% Asian, small percentage of multiracial. And that, if you look up the state at large, that's pretty much what it looks like. At the same time, you'll find very few districts that look like us, because the fact of the matter is the state of New York is one of the most segregated states in the country in terms of its enrollment. So, you know, back to the question about institutional racism that Dr. Alston was just speaking about, it's very clear to us when we examine our data. First of all, if you look at us, we're a very high-performing school district. We have very strong SAT scores. We have a large percentage of students going on to four-year colleges, many of them attending probably the types of schools that Dr. Alston attended as well. And you'll look at us and say, wow, this is a very high-performing district. However, it's not until you start uncovering, disaggregating the data that you do see that something is at work within our schools. As he was speaking about disproportionality in other sectors, It's very clear in almost every area that we would examine in our school district, whether you want to look at graduation rates, whether you look at who's in our advanced placement and honor courses, who's being referred to special education. One that always jumps at us is discipline. Who's being referred, who's being suspended in discipline. And what you see in each and every case is a level of disproportionality. So what does that tell us? It tells us, and if you look at the history of the formulation of public schools in this country, they're continuing to produce, and they're designed to produce the types of results that they're getting. They were never really intended to necessarily give attention to persons of color. And while it may not be as, it's much more clandestine in our belief in terms of what's happening, but there's a clear pattern that tells us that each and every year that we continue to get these results, there's something at work that we really do have to undo. And while we've been spending a lot of our attention over a number of years of trying to fix kids, it was not really until we brought in an expert consultant that really understands the dynamic of racism in this country, particularly as it applies to institutions, that's helped us to, as she describes, turning the mirror inward and starting to look at our system and giving less attention to fixing kids.
Yeah, it's great. You have a great success story there, Dr. Montesano, and I know you've built over a number of years the awareness that you need to have there. Some of the larger cultural things that we do find to support the evidence, we've talked a lot about evidence and why it's so important, because the evidence is going to tell us and help validate that the systemic racism or institutional racism is there. But some of the other things in the reality that we all live in is called redlining, which has to do with real estate and the ability to get mortgages and purchase property. School funding is another big issue for New York State around how we equitably and fairly fund. Racial profiling, which Dr. Alliston mentioned, implicit bias, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. The GI Bill that had a lot of inequities in it as well. We've had a policy workshop, a couple of them that talked about school to prison pipeline. That's another way in which school districts set up mostly young Black men to end up in the prison system, and disproportionality in the job market, like you've already mentioned. How do we get people of color into the job market for our school districts? That's a very big question. We're going to discuss that a little bit more in depth in our third webinar coming up in the early part of 2021. So we know that the community out there is really calling for this conversation to happen in our school districts, which is one of the reasons why we're here today. And we just have to have a response for that. We have to build the conversation here amongst ourselves, amongst our board members and administrators and superintendents alike, to begin to have this conversation internally within the school structure to understand where can we address institutional racism with some set of best practices. And as we get a little bit further into our next question, maybe we can talk a little bit more about what those things are. But we know we do have to address this. This is not a conversation that we can look at, 5 years down the road. We know this conversation needs to start happening now. So we've talked a little bit about institutional racism now, but I'd like to talk a little bit further about implicit bias, because I think that goes hand in hand. And so, Mark, I'm going to turn this conversation back over to you to help us dig a little deeper.
Thank you, Darcy. And as we just discussed, there's often a clear path to evidence of institutional racism, because we can see it in school funding. We can see it in disproportionality. And so if a school board, for example, wanted to identify that there was a case of institutional racism, or if their system, Dr. Montesano said, their system sense. There's data that they can look at to track that that there is that institutional racism by looking at the disproportionality that may exist in student performance, in attendance rates, dropout rates, by looking at the curriculum and seeing if there's a balanced representation in what's being taught to the students, to show that historical events are being learned from a variety of perspectives. And then there's also climate surveys and getting feedback from your staff and from your students to be able to identify the struggles that may exist for all of our population. But that being said, there's another less obvious contributing factor to institutional racism, and that's implicit bias. And with implicit bias, we're talking about people, many of whom would sincerely describe themselves as not racist and committed to fair treatment for all, but nonetheless harboring implicit racial biases and being influenced by these biases and their behaviors. These biases will operate automatically, often triggered by societal norms, long-held beliefs, stereotypes. And with all that, Dr. Montesano, can you please share how implicit biases can impact an educational system?
Sure, Mark. I think where my focus is how it impacts our students, because after all, that's what we're about, right? And I think the way I'm going to start with that question is asking all of us to think about our own schooling experience and what teachers pop up in our minds that have served the greatest influence to us. And I would venture to say that all of us will come up with a teacher that, for me, was Mrs. Flynn in 6th grade, because she had this ability to believe in me. I still don't to this day know exactly what it was, but there was this connection that she really demonstrated to me, that she cared about me and had a strong belief in me. And we know, all of us that have spent time in the classroom, we know if there's one particular variable that makes all the difference in the world, what kind of learning will take place, it's that sense of belief. And in my mind, when you're speaking about implicit bias, it's the antithesis of a teacher's belief in a student. First of all, we all know that our teachers come into this profession. It is a wonderful profession because it's filled with a moral purpose about shaping the lives of young people. It's probably what attracted almost all of us to this profession, and we understand that. So people are here to, our staff is here to help, not to harm. And when I think of an implicit bias, it's kind of like the spinach in your teeth. You know it exists, but I don't see it in myself. And I'll give you a couple of clear examples of implicit bias that was a real wake-up call for me as the superintendent of this school district. We have a wonderful Nyack center in our community that serves our kids extraordinarily well. And they have a teen council, Nyack Teen Council, which is primarily comprised of Black African American teenagers. And they had called me to a meeting together and and I thought we created a nice safe space. And they shared with me some of the things that were concerning to them. And they seem to be rather benign. So as one example, at our high school, there's what we call a cafe option, where kids have kind of a prep period or study hall, and upperclassmen can gravitate to the cafeteria. And as you would anticipate, and again, I heard you heard me talk about the makeup of our school. Our kids tend to gravitate by race, when they sit at these tables, because it's freedom to sit where you want to. And our security personnel doing their jobs, they walk into the cafeteria, and what table do they go to ask the kids' schedule, and are you supposed to be here? Are you sure you have a free period? It's our Black African American students that they go to. And one of the kids said to me in English class, the teacher, with well intention, was talking to kids about making sure they get their college essays done. It was a junior class. It was the time of the year, and yet this Black African American female was not being asked by the teacher whether or not her essay had been ready. So what's the messaging that these kids get? While that security person, that English teacher did not see that, did not intentionally do harm, but at the same time, the message was not lost on the kids. So while we're talking about institutional racism and its impact and disproportionality and I would encourage districts, certainly, which I think they're doing, is to look at hard data, which is a real easy explanation. But if you really wanted to hear what's happening in your schools, talk to your kids, talk to your staff of color, not just your teachers, but all other various personnel. Create a safe space. And we did it in our district, again, with a consultant. We gave the keys to her room, let her speak directly with the kids. And those very kind of stories I spoke about. And by the way, she talked to kids in elementary schools, middle school, and high school. One theme that came through that did in fact match our data was back to discipline, where our white students, in the minds of our Black students, could see things happening in the school for the same infractions. They were not being disciplined, the white students, but yet the Black students were. And even more subtle things, like in a classroom, when a student has a wrong answer, what does that teacher do? Because typically what a teacher will do, I know I've done, because it's been pointed out to me back in the day when I was a teacher, I will spend more time with that student in the class who I think has the ability to answer that question correctly. Are you sure you heard the question correctly? I'll paraphrase the question. But yet, if it's a student I don't think is as capable, and maybe it's out of my own empathy to not embarrass that student, I'm going to say, okay, Karen, what do you think? And not spend a lot of time with that student. But again, it's the message that that student is getting, that student of color is getting from our school, that you're less than. And it is the white students that are the privileged, that are the bright kids. That's implicit bias, and we know it's at work. Our hope is that by training that we do in our districts to raise that awareness, that our staff, again, because they're here to help, not to harm, are going to be more in tune with that and be much more responsive in their classrooms.
Thank you, Dr. Montesano. Dr. Alston, anything you would add to this question of implicit bias? It sounds very familiar to me, like in the Johari window, which is sort of like a business model of, we have things we don't see. They call it the blind spot. One of the windows in that quadrant is called the blind spot, the things that we're not really aware of. What is give us your opinion, thoughts on implicit bias?
Well, if let's start with the premise that many of us in society live siloed lives, right? And what I mean by that, and this is based on a study that many white people have very few connections socially with people different from them, right? They may be in the workplace, but that's not by choice. That's by chance, right? So if you have very little interactions with people other than people like you, right? Then where do you get your information on people who are not like you? Well, there's television, there's reports, there's this. And if that information is typically negative, right? And you have a sound mind, one's inclination is to have a negative disposition for people they don't have relationship with, right? And so we built, because we are humans and already have built-in preferences. Now, what do I mean by that? If I ask this panel, Elton John or Billy Joel, you probably would have a preference for whatever reason, Four Tops or the Temptations, right? My mother is going straight Temptations. That's her preference, right? And so as human beings, we have these built-in preferences for what we like, things that really resonate with us. So now we couple that with the social aspect that we really don't have connections with people. Now, here's a test that we can do, right? Now, at this point, I'm hoping we're not having visitors to the house often, but prior to the pandemic, when was the last time you had someone of Hispanic or African-American descent in your home for a social visit? That's the key, that's your diversity marker, right? Because that is as intimate as it gets. And if you don't have those relationships, right, then you don't know that much. Let's put it there. So now we carry these biases, we don't have the kind of information, and we're at a deficit. Now, how does that play out sometimes professionally? I've sat in many different arenas, and a person of color comes in, and the committee, right? Because we hire by committee. The committee often will look at the Hispanic or African American and wonder what the credentials are, right? And say, but they didn't ask that for the white candidate. They just assume the person has what they have, and that has never come up. Or one of the things I call like the key word for someone who's barely competent, he's a great guy. But that's not, we're not hiring for the great guy. We're hiring for who's best to help these students get, or the mission of the school, right? And so what I am inviting people to do is take a look at their own preferences, take a look at their own social circles, because social circle is by choice, right? And that'll kind of open up how you can know someone and you can have a different experience other than what you get on television. Last short story, we just had this election, and this is not political, although there's a context. So I'm at voting, in-person voting, because I wanted to vote. And two women in front of me, Caucasian women, are debating. One's conservative and one's liberal, and one's pro. All right, I get it. So the woman says, hey, I can't believe you're voting. We're having this conversation. You're voting for Trump. She says, oh, he's great. He's done so many different things. She reads off the talking points. And he has the platinum plans for African Americans. So they turn to me, right? And say, well, what do you think about Trump? And I said, look, you don't know me and I don't know you. So it doesn't necessarily matter what I think. But what do your African Americans say about President Trump? He said, well, I don't have any. I said, well, that's the issue. You don't have a point of reference because you don't have relationship. And until you can have relationship, it doesn't matter with this stranger. And I did not look like this. I had on, you know, what I would typically wear on a cold, rainy Suffolk County day to go vote, which is jeans and a hat or something. And so as long as we're willing to stay comfortable in our silos, we're at a disadvantage for preparing people, right? The people we're charged to serve, to have the full experience of a global village, right? That's a piece that that's the price we pay for keeping our circle small and carrying these implicit biases with us, because these biases don't serve any greater good. And I would say now is certainly not the time to limit opportunity in a nation that needs more opportunity than ever. Thank you.
Yeah. So, yes, I so agree with you, Dr. Alston. And I think you bring up a really important point that, Karen, I want to get your input and feedback on. And that is, we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable in this kind of conversation. The implicit bias conversation is not an easy one to have, because you have to be, first of all, open-minded to even step into the conversation and get some productive dialogue going in it. And I know, Karen, you've been a longstanding board member there at NYAC, and I know your board has gone through training and a whole lot of other dialogue and conversations there in NYAC about racism. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the conversations you might have had around implicit bias, or just in general, that you feel the board has really grown in their understanding, or what kind of commitment have they made either in the past or currently to really deal with implicit bias? Can you share with us a little bit of that?
Yeah, thanks, Darcy. I think one of the things that we realized as a group, that it was incumbent on all of us to take the opportunity to educate ourselves and expand our own understanding of institutional racism. So we talk about institutional racism and implicit bias, and Dr. A was correct, right? We've got to address these implicit biases, but if you don't get past that, you can't address systemic racism, because if you don't understand your own biases, you'll never understand the concept of the whole and the system that is failing our kids, right? the consultant that Dr. Montesano referred to, who worked with us for 2 years, 2.5 years, said it's not about fixing the kids, it's about fixing the system, right? The kids aren't broken, right? So get that out of your mind. But as Dr. Montesano said, with the examples he gave of where the mindset is with certain teachers, you're never going to get to the point of understanding the systemic changes if you don't understand some of the root cause and the things that are happening. So Dr. Montesano referenced the focus groups that have happened, and we heard this bubbling up in the district. The board heard it from community members, from students as well, that there is a problem. We would look at our data. We understood the disproportionality in our data. It wasn't necessarily disaggregated as we wanted it to be, but we started to probe to get a better understanding ourselves of what the problems were and where they lay. Once we did that, we said, okay, we've got to tackle this. What do we do? And we've got to educate ourselves, as I said. And we felt that leadership started from the top. And we had a course recommended to us called Undoing Racism, which is run by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And it's a comprehensive, an intensive, I should say, 2.5 day workshop that takes you back to the roots of institutional racism. I mean, this goes back, I'm talking 1619 and even before, bringing us all the way up. It had a profound impact on me personally, but it started to drive our sense of we've got to fix things. We can't stay where we are. There's a problem here. And once you have that training, there's a discussion around implicit bias, a discussion around systemic racism, but once you have that, you can't stay still. You can't not do something about it. You know, one of their principles is that racism has been consciously and systematically constructed and can only be undone if people understand what it is, where it comes from, how it functions, and why it's perpetuated. So we keep that at the fore. The principles of undoing racism are the core and the underpinnings how we want to take it. So we all attended the racism workshop, and I can tell you 100% of the board attended, 100% of our district and school leadership have attended, and we've got about somewhere between 40 and 50% of our staff who have attended these courses. So, you know, we've embedded it in our goals. You know, not our district goals. We have board-specific goals, right? Where we've said each board member must attend the Undoing Racism workshop in their first term, preferably in their first year. And then we have other goals that must attend equity-based events, meetings, forums, or there's a community forum called Continuing the Conversation. We attend that. Board members, again, it's not mandatory, but there is a sense of we've got a moral responsibility to see this through, to be the leaders, to stand up, and as I say, be the change, right, that we wish to see. You know, we embark on, we don't have any formal book studies, but, you know, we have a lot of well-read individuals amongst our midst in our staff, and we're continually getting book recommendations and sharing those with each other and reading books and having discussions, whether one-on-one in groups with staff. It's also important that we support staff. So it's important that we're seen to be trying to effect this change. We need to be seen to be supporting the effort.
Karen, that's fantastic. I love the dedication that your board has shown toward professional development and toward crafting this vision for your district that is based in equity. And I think for me anyway, the big takeaway that I'm going to get today is going back to, we need to fix systems. We're not going to fix kids. Kids aren't broken. And so the system needs to be tailored and adapted to meet the needs of the kids. And as we think of kids, and I'll open this up to the panel, what do we know to be the impact of institutional racism and implicit bias on our students? How really does it impact them? Does it make a difference in the lives and in the education of our students?
That's a powerful question, and I want to commend Karen and her colleagues and Dr. Montesano. What they talked about was a leadership issue, right? Someone or a group of people said, we need to take this on, right? And once they not only take it on, but get a deep understanding of it. And so there was leadership and there was a level of commitment. But from that, right, look at the results that Nyack produces. If this is about education, right, we want to look at how students are doing. And so to go back to your question, I just thought I wanted to share that. But to go back to the question, I'll rephrase the question and then try and answer it. Like, what is the impact of having a young person of color not believe that they are as good or as good as anyone else? What is the impact of believing that your only reference in school, the history of your people, is either colonized or enslavement? What does that do to the self-image that you have, right? What is the impact when a teacher looks at you and calls you out to because they assume you shouldn't be in the AP class? Were you sure, Mr. Snyder? This is the AP class. What is that saying indirectly to you? Now, does that mean that person is a racist? Absolutely not. But that could be the implicit bias. So what I'm suggesting is that people who believe they're going somewhere behave very differently than people who are going nowhere, right? And the impact of implicit bias is often, all too often, the default for kids of color is that there are minimal expectations, right? And when one begins to internalize minimal expectations, they tend to not get maximum results.
If I could just also add that to that question, Mark, in terms of the impact on the life of a student. In the life of a teacher, what greater tragedy is there than unmet or unrealized potential of one of your students? And once again, that's what we see, is this, because if you really study brain research, there's no difference in our brains regardless of the color of our skin. But yet again, we see the same type of results that occur on a regular basis. So yeah, our objective in our district is to ensure that every child, each and every child, has the opportunity to maximize their own potential and to have that opportunity to have that brought out. And again, it goes back to having teachers, and not just teachers, it's bus drivers, it's secretaries, it's security, believing in that child. In fact, we have a Mattering campaign led by our Director of Equity going on right now during this pandemic, just to ensure that every child recognizes that they matter in this school district. And I also want to just speak about this concept of, particularly a district like ours, because we are a very high achieving district. And kind of the elephant in the room always for us was this kind of zero-sum balance, that if we're giving all this attention in the district to equity, as if it's only about equity, about, quote, fixing kids. This is not about it, because the tragedy is just as, or is impactful for our white students as well, to be raised in a society that makes them feel somehow privileged or better than. So we look at this in a total kind of makeup, but will in fact our attention to equity in the Nyack public schools somehow diminish or take away from the students that are already doing well, this kind of zero-sum balance? And I'm really proud to say, and keep in mind, it's not in our district, we also give great attention to curriculum alignment. The Board of Education provides tremendous resources for teacher training and training for all of us. But the point is, so we've been at this for a number of years, and I'll tell you what we're seeing. We are seeing, in fact, increased, enhanced achievement, not just for our students of color, but for all kids in this district. Our high school profile has been raised tremendously in terms of, always in the rankings, in the top tier of schools. If you put any stock in standardized tests in grades 3 to 8, this district's achievement levels have raised tremendously in the lower Hudson Valley, just in terms of point of comparison. And we're seeing just, our most recent graduation rates of our Black African-American students. When I look back 5 years ago, we were hovering around 82, 83%. It was 92% this past year. So what does that tell us? It tells us that this work that we're devoting in this district is not just benefiting the students who we have not been adequately meeting their needs. It's really benefiting everybody. In fact, our middle school principal, Dave Johnson, often quotes John F. Kennedy that a rising tide lifts all boats, and we firmly believe that here.
In terms of impact of implicit bias on students of color, if you'll allow me to tell a quick story. I did grow up in London, and when I was going to school, I was one of those kids on the lower tier of things. The teachers had no interest in me, and subsequently I had no interest in school. And at the time, my mother said, okay, I know this kid's fairly bright. I can't have this happen. And she sent me out to Jamaica to live with my grandmother. Now, what's the first thing? 90% of the people look like me. So my own perception of success, I looked around me and I could see kids who looked like me, people who looked like me, successful people who looked like me. And I instantly changed. My teacher, my grandmother let her know, listen, she's not very bright, so you're going to have to work with her. And she said, look, don't worry about it. And suddenly I see a teacher who cares about me. And if you had an implicit bias, it certainly wasn't around. And it did make a difference. It made a difference to me because suddenly I believed. It was tough. Jamaican teachers and parents are really, really tough. But the point was that I responded to that because I had no doubt in my mind that I was being supported and that I had this whole support system around me. And it wasn't just school, and this is something we're trying to do in Nyack as well. It's community, it's church leaders, a family. And that's what we're essentially trying to do here in Nyack, create that support system all around that people feel, yes, everywhere I go, wherever I look, I know that people believe that I can succeed. It's hard, but we will get there. We're committed to getting there.
That's a great point, Karen. And I actually was going to ask you to respond a little bit more about families and the importance of engaging families to really help build that sense of support for students. Can you or Dr. Montesano or Dr. Alliston talk a little bit about how important is it to engage families and also to kind of reshape the culture, I think is, what all of you have alluded to on one level or another. Can you speak at all about how we need to engage families and what's important about that?
Sure. I'll go ahead, Karen.
Oh, go ahead, Dr. Go ahead.
So engaging family, I volunteered because my office is the Office of Access, Equity, and Community Engagement Services. And there's a director of family and community engagement who reports to me when we fill that position. And also because through My Brother's Keeper, we have family and community engagement grants. But I say all of that to say the school district's relationship with family and community, the better the relationship, the better the possibility of success. If the school could do it alone, we would do it alone. It just doesn't work that way. If the community could do it alone, you wouldn't need school. But when you have them working together, you get really significant results. And so what does that mean and what does that look like? Well, I think there's a universal way you can look at what it means. What it looks like will depend on where you are. And I think it comes down to, one of my mentors taught me this, does the interaction gender trust, confidence, and respect? Do I believe you can do what you say you're going to do with my child, Dr. Montesano? Right? When you engage me, is there a level of respect that you hear what I'm saying? And you don't have to agree all the time, but you hear me and you respect it, right? Do I trust? Do you engage in behaviors that make me believe I trust you? Do you follow through, right? Do you do what you said you were going to do? Those are three things that I think are key. But I don't want to say, because often in the spirit of increasing student outcomes, they say, well, it's the family because the family broke down and therefore I get this result. Not only do I not accept that professionally, there's evidence to the contrary that, yes, it's ideal. That is the ideal condition. But, you know, life doesn't deal us necessarily ideal hands all of the time. And so that there are things that we can do as school communities. And I actually led a study across the state that took unscreened public high schools that were doing well above the state graduation rate, some as high as 100% graduation rate for young men of color, right? Unscreened, non-charter. And so we know it can happen, and they come from the same kinds of communities where other leaders will say, well, we don't have the family connection. And so therefore, right, if one country can go to the moon, all countries can go to the moon, right? So that's my response.
Great, thank you, Dr. Alston.
What I was going to say is that, you know, we've certainly noticed that we do not get the engagement of families of color as much as we do the families of white students for various reasons, whether it be socioeconomic or otherwise, you know. So we look at ways of trying to have them engaged. You know, we're trying to let our teachers know, do the outreach, not because the parent didn't turn up at a PTA conference, do that outreach. Why did that happen, right? Understand some of these factors that make it a little bit more difficult. I was going to get into this a little later, but we've developed a strategic racial equity plan. And one of the pillars of that plan is around community engagement, to be able to foster this very support system that Dr. A talked about that we need to have in place, because we know it's not as strong as we would want it to be. But it's important to do that outreach. We have a very progressive community overall who love to be part of our school district and be involved in everything we're doing. And you know, our efforts around equity have piqued their interest, so they're chomping at the bit to get involved and help us along. And it's wonderful, because it's what we need. As Dr. A says, we can't do this alone, right? When we talk about institutional racism, it isn't just the school. It's the housing, it's the incarceration, it's in politics. So we're this one cog in the wheel that we're trying to fix, but where we can do outreach and get support beyond our school alone, we're certainly aiming to do that.
Yeah.
If I could just add one last thing with regard to the role of a board member, because I know a lot of the audience are members of boards of education. You know, it's not surprising that families, particularly of color, who have not had positive experiences, you know, interacting with our schools, will be less likely to want to interact, right? And one of the things that our Board of Education does extraordinarily well is they are 7 highly active people within our community. They are in spaces that occupy our parents and you know, students and so forth. And as a result, they've really generated a great deal of trust within the community, so that it's not uncommon for members of our board to be the voices of some of our parents who would not otherwise communicate with us. And again, I think that's, you know, it's almost like having 7 tentacles that are within your community. And I really do think that's a very powerful role that boards of education can play in this work.
And I couldn't agree more, Dr. Montesano. I wanted to ask you another question, Dr. Montesano. You and I had a conversation early on where you said, you know, without the support of my board, I could never have really gone down this path. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that originated and what were those early days like when perhaps the board came to you and said, this is important, or maybe you approached them and they agreed? I mean, tell us a little bit about what that was like for you in the early going.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that for any superintendent is to be attracted to a district like Nyack, because it really is just, first of all, just not only just an amazing community as Karen was describing, but it really is a microcosm of the public education system in America and all of its failings and successes. And you know, looking at that quote achievement gap that existed, I still think back 10 years ago was one of the things that really interested me, intrigued me. And I do recall the level of frustration early on, where we were, again, back to this fixing kids, trying to, you know, put on all these intervention programs, which are still necessary, but not really seeing the significant gains and you know, going forward. And I do have to mention a real dear friend to the Nyack Public Schools, Phyllis Frank, who has been really the coordinator of these Undoing Racism workshops in Rockland County in New York for many, many years. And her encouraging me to attend these workshops. And eventually, there was 13 of us, including a number of board members, several of our senior leadership in the district that attended the first one. And it really was, as Karen described earlier, a tremendous enlightenment to really understand the history, which I think is a critical part of this, is understanding the history of racism as a social construct in America. And that really led us, the 13 of us, to really become much more energized that maybe we aren't looking at this in the right way, and how critical it was for us to latch on to real expertise, people that really understand, that have studied racism, but particularly institutional racism, because as you know, none of us, you really think about it, isn't it amazing that we know this is a critical problem in America, but yet in any profession, whether it's education, you know, law, business, we don't study racism. You know, we don't really, as leaders in schools, we're not prepared to lead this work. It's not something that is at the focal point of where we're going. So in our minds, we were really, you know, starting to put down and charting, you know, this pathway of this uncharted waters of how we're going to get there. And there was a lot of missteps along the way, but you know, part of the change process is having a clear vision of where you want to go. What does that desired state look like? What do we want for our kids? And validating where we think we are, you know, that kind of discrepancy analysis. This is what's happening with our kids in this level of disproportionality. And that's when it began to emerge, as Karen talked about, this racial equity plan in terms of what are these, and we have these 4 pillars of which identify these areas that we have to work on as a school district, and being very patient with our outcomes, but being very urgent with our actions. And, you know, really began to try to formulate how are we going to go about this, you know, and it includes things like, you know, looking at, and we're like probably most districts, we're still about 80% of our staff in this district are white. So how do we address that? And we have plans and strategies of how to go forward. How do we develop a culturally responsive teaching staff so that all of us can be more in tune with our own biases and the messaging, as we spoke about, of how it, and the board as a whole is looking at their own policies through an equity lens. And, you know, are we in fact, because the real key question in our minds is, are we as individuals complicit in perpetuating institutional racism in the Nyack public schools? And how is our district as a whole complicit in continuing to get those results? And I think in our minds is trying to develop a sense of urgency and recognizing that to this day, we can predict with great accuracy every kindergartner that walks into our school what their 13 years in this public school is going to be like. And we can pretty much predict what their outcomes are going to look like depending on where in our community they reside, which again has to do with race and social economic conditions. But what are we going to do right now to change that trajectory for each and every child? And look, this is messy work, right? I mean, I know Dr. Alston, who has worked in various components, understands change process. And, you know, one thing that school organizations have not been very good at is change. Look, I've been a superintendent for over 20 years. I can't tell you, I can't count on two hands how many reforms I've been through. We don't tend to take on change very well. We start change, we just don't typically finish. You know, very often it's another superintendent rides into town, and rightfully so. Some of our teachers sit back and say, I can ride this one out. You know, we'll just see what the next guy brings into town. And also, it, you know, has a lot to do with how dissatisfied people are in terms of why are we doing this change. You know, if existing conditions are not, you're not upset with them, then what are we doing? Why are we changing this? And I think all school districts should recognize that our demographics are changing. So you may not be confronting this currently, but it is coming. And I think, as Dr. Alston said on the onset, the changing dynamics of this country, I think, are forcing all of us to be much more engaged. I can share with you, when our district first started looking at this, I remember many superintendents asked me, like, why are you touching this? Like, why are you getting involved in this mess? But yet, you know, this summer into this September, I must have had a dozen or more calls from school districts who are getting pressure, superintendents who are getting pressure in their own communities, that people are beginning to be less satisfied. And that's a big part of getting a change process going.
Thank you, Dr. Montesano. And Dr. Alston, I see you shaking your head a lot as he's talking. And I'm just curious, you know, you have a statewide view a little bit from your office at SED. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what you're seeing across the state. What are some of those conversations you're having, perhaps with other stakeholders across the state or other districts, other superintendents, other perhaps board members, around how we get through this? I mean, there is pressure from the community. We all really are seeing that very clearly. So, you know, how do you see it, and what would you say to boards and superintendents across the state about how to tackle this, how to approach this?
Well, the beauty is there are blueprints, right? And so the reason Nyack is where they are today is because of decisions and actions that were made yesterday, right? And so now they can become a resource, right? Because they did the work yesterday. Now, of course, they have some arrows in their back and some wounds to lick because it's messy. But the key there, and the reason why I'm shaking my head, because when he said, you know, it's messy, I'm saying, you better believe it's messy. But with a solid board that understands what's at stake and what they took a vow to, right? It's back to that vow. All means all. And so they did the work. So from the state education department, what I am seeing is what Dr. Montesano is hearing. There are communities that are saying, well, how do all of a sudden, like there's a push, like this equity, these gaps are not acceptable. And there are models where they are doing tremendous things. And so I think from the state education department, being the assistant commissioner for access equity, right? We know that there are models that work well, right? We know there are school districts that have taken guiding principles and put it together. So one of the initiatives out of my office is the My Brother's Keeper initiative. Actually, many of the opportunity programs come right through my office, be it Smart Scholars, P-TECH, My Brother's Keeper, HEOP, right? So these are opportunity programs. And through the My Brother's Keeper, I've watched one city school district, in the Yonkers for that matter, use this model of My Brother's Keeper, right? To be the driving force behind the entire district, right? Teachers, parents, community, and it's the government office, the mayor's office, the school district, the business, and the not-for-profit organization. For them, it's Nepperhan, right? And they move together as a unit because they all touch the children, the future, the family, the community. And so this work on equity is a national, and it starts with community, but it's a statewide and national, and I'll call it an opportunity to maximize the talent of the young people who we serve. And it is in our interest, both state and nationally, to educate highly literate, articulate, critical thinkers who can identify and solve complex problems in an ethical and just manner. And I'll tell you why. You cannot fight a fight with one hand tied behind your back. And when we do not educate all, and when all does not mean all, and by the way, institutional racism ties one hand behind the back, you're at a disadvantage. You can't win, right? And so many, many years ago, the United States didn't have to, the competition was self. That's just not the world anymore. So when we talk about global competitiveness, right? Those who have the resources to put their kids in elite schools, God bless them, right? But public education has always been the engine in this country, right? To help us live into a better tomorrow. So that would be my response.
Yeah. Yeah, education still is the single strongest lever for our kids to really help them make that leap up, no matter where they start. But certainly if you're starting in a lower level or your achievement gap is greater, if you can have those teachers, that institution, etc., that's your single greatest lever to really help you achieve whatever it is you want to achieve in life. And I agree with you. I like the analogy, you know, one hand tied behind your back does not make for a good advantage point to achieve what you would like to achieve or be at your best potential. We have sort of started to dive into this area of solutions, but I wanted Mark to take us into this question a little bit further about what are the possible solutions that we see. So Mark, I'm going to hand it off to you to ask that final question to our panelists.
Yeah, thanks, Darcy. And now we get to my favorite part of the webinar, which is our call to action. And we have unpacked a lot today. We've gone through some really heavy issues. And Karen, I'd like to address this question to you first, as someone who's been doing this work as part of a school governance team that is dedicated to this type of organizational change. So if our goal is to ensure that institutional racism and implicit bias are reduced and eradicated in our schools, what are steps board members can take to make this a reality?
We might not have your microphone on, Karen, if you can pop on your microphone.
Sorry, yes, Mark had let me know there was a buzz coming from my machine, so I was keeping it off. My apologies. Sorry, Mark, what I was saying, that in discussion with you yesterday and with Dr. Montesano, he made a statement which I must admit I agreed with. You know, the boards are often the authors of change, but most time we tend to have this exaggerated level of optimism about everything that we can achieve until you really get down into the nitty-gritty. You know, we really do need to anticipate resistance. So the thing with the board is to understand that, first of all, and understand that it will be a challenge, but take it a step at a time. I talked about the Undoing Racism workshop that we started with. That's where we started once we had an understanding of the problems we have. And it's certainly something that I would recommend a lot of boards to look at, because it certainly opened our eyes and really put us on the path to where we are now. Let's talk about our budget. You know, one of our board members often says, you know, your budget informs your priorities, right? So where are your priorities? If addressing equity is a priority, then you need to earmark funding to support that. So 2-3 years ago, we decided we needed an equity consultant in to help us get on the road, provide us a framework, and help us address, starting with implicit bias, but overall systemic racism. And we've had it for 2 years, so we committed the money to do that. Last year, we decided we needed to make that effort permanent, and we put money in the budget to hire a director of equity to help drive the program. You know, funding for materials, programs, staff development, books. We've got to, you know, they will come to you. We find our staff getting excited about this initiative and wanting to progress it. And so as they come to you, you've got to be able to support from a funding standpoint what they need to get this going. But that's important. So take a look at that. As I said, you know, your budget informs your priorities. You've got to have a plan. And we talk about vision, missions, goals. We have that. We have this really comprehensive racial equity plan. It's a strategic plan, and it really is the linchpin of our efforts. Now, we're lucky to have gotten to this point because it was based on the framework and the ideals that our consultant had set for us. We started putting it together about 18 months ago. It was in draft. We're still tweaking it. We're still discussing it. What do we think about this wording? Is this where we want to be? You know, but again, the vision for where we want to go is based in the belief and is rooted in efficacy. And Dr. Montesano talked about that. You know, every student can learn, right? We feel we have a moral imperative to make sure that we have success. We've set a mission that we're going to provide a program of excellence to all of our kids. We've got a goal, create a district-wide climate and culture that demands and supports systemic equity and improved outcomes for all students. So it may be a racial equity plan, but as Dr. Montesano pointed to, this is a plan that ensures success for all students, right? You must have a plan. You must have a roadmap for where you want to go, right? This is difficult as it is. If you don't have that, you don't have that foundation of a vision, a mission, and goals, you will fail because this is broad, it is complex, it is difficult. Once you go to Undoing Racism and you understand the principles, that will help, right? And of course, Nyack will be there to help you because we've plowed the road before. As Dr. Montesano said, you know, we had these 4 pillars, and it's a very comprehensive plan. But what we asked our director of equity to do this summer was to develop an action plan, and that's always the difficult piece. So groups, and I find this in my corporate life as well, can get into a state of analysis paralysis where you're forever analyzing, looking at data, slicing and dicing. Oh, we've got a problem. What are we going to do? But execution. So now that you've got that, how are you going to execute? So for each of the pillars we've got about 12 to 13 strategies for each of them, right? That all talk to reducing implicit bias and institutional racism and improving the outcomes for all kids. So we have that, and we're working towards that now. It's a comprehensive plan. We set up like sponsors to drive the program, so everybody's involved. But more importantly, or just as importantly, we formed what we call an equity steering committee because we felt that, and it consists of 3 board members, Dr. Montesano, our director of equity, and our director of curriculum and instruction, because we felt we didn't want it too big. It needed to be small, agile, focused. And the point of this committee is to understand, drive the program forward. Now, as a board, you don't operationalize things. You don't manage operations. That's up to Dr. Montesano and his staff. But we're providing steer, we're providing governance, we're providing input to make sure that this group knows they have our support for this plan and for the execution. We want to see results, right? So we have structured reporting that comes back to the steering committee on a monthly basis, and we talk about how we're progressing, where are the problems, what do we need, do we have funding issues, right? And then once a quarter, which we haven't started, but that's the plan, to have this steering committee with the director of equity report back to the entire board on our progress. So you've got to have that structure. So you need a plan, you need an execution plan. So you need your strategy, you need an execution plan, and then you need to actually manage it and govern it to make sure that you can achieve the goals that you're looking to achieve. Other things, creating a supportive, safe, supportive school climate. Coming out of Undoing Racism, we have what we call post-conversations, post-UDR conversation groups. We have where we discuss principles. We have courageous conversations, and those numbers within each school building. We have facilitators. Phyllis Frank is our overall facilitator for these courageous conversations. We have building equity teams who themselves are looking at, more specifically around our plan, disproportionality. They're looking at the climate culture within their buildings. How do we change it? So our staff are embracing it. But again, you've got to have this board support and make them understand, we're with you in this, right? We understand this. Access to high-level curriculum. And again, all of these are in our strategies. They're in our plans. We have our guidance department looking at AP enrollment data. We've got an AVID program that starts with our 6th graders and preparing them for APs. But we understand that there needs to be some sort of vertical alignment, because you don't just find the problem of a lack of representation in APs by looking at your 9th grade enrollment and 10th grade. You've got to go back to 3rd grade, and Dr. Montesano talks about it. So we've got to look at our data, have it disaggregated, and say, where did the problem start? And we're starting to do that now, right? And understanding that it's not just look at this thing right here, right? It is systemic, right? That's the whole point, and we're starting to do a lot of that. Policies, we spoke about that. Dr. Montesano touched on that. We're looking at our policies with an equity lens. We recently looked at, believe it or not, our athletic eligibility policy, right? And we looked at that and we said, well, it's not working. We're failing our kids, right? And let's take a hard look at that. We had our principals, our sports director, we had coaches, we had the board, we had parents on our committee looking at that policy to make it a lot more equitable and supportive of our athletes. And again, not just policies, our practices, looking at restorative justice, right? I could go into a whole conversation about that, but these are some of the things that you really want to take a look at as a board and understand, are we being fair? We're teeing up the code of conduct to look at that shortly. Again, through development, there are a number of us who were on the NYSSBA webinar the other day around the equity policy, and we were smiling with each other because we're like, wait a minute, all of that's in our equity plan. And we thought, well, wait a minute, you've got the plan, but not the policy. But, so now we've got to sit back and we're really saying, no, let's make a formal policy, because when we're off the board, we need to make sure people understand that this is the policy. This lives beyond us, right? It really does. And we've got to put the framework and the tools in place to make sure that it continues long beyond the tenure of this particular board. And then community engagement, another point, but we spoke about that. But there are challenges. I talked about going to the Undoing Racism and how profound it was for me. I will confess, as it will Jim, that we'll send teachers to this. Some teachers who come back and say, I don't get it, don't understand it, right? Don't know why I was saying, right? So there are challenges there, and it's around our teaching staff. We have a great group, and the majority of whom are, as I said, chomping on the bit to participate and see this through. And we're doing everything we can as a board to support them, however we can.
Thank you, Karen. That's quite a comprehensive list, and yeah, aces to you folks there. So I heard you talk again about the Undoing Racism training, and could you just tell us the website again for our board members out there who might be interested in seeing if they can get that professional development training? If you know the website again.
I'll get it. I don't have it. I'll get it. I'll make sure it's posted before we finish the.
Yeah, and
the
I would imagine if you Googled Undoing Racism, you'd probably find it as well out there. If you want to go ahead and Google it, you might just find it. So you obviously have a plan that's strategic. You had a very specific equity strategic plan put in place, and it does take time and it does take effort, and I'm sure that's both from the board level, as well as Lee said earlier, you know, Dr. Montesano is in charge of operationalizing it. So it really sounds like it is working hand in hand, you know, the board creating and being involved in the strategic level thinking, and then the equity officer, which you hired, your director, I guess, of equity, really creating that action plan and really helping to get it put into place. So it really sounds like it really is a hand-in-hand kind of work between the board and the administrative team to help make it happen on down throughout the system. I would love to continue this conversation for the next 2 hours, which I'm sure we could have, but I know we are running out of time. And I wanted to give each of you on our panel here a couple of minutes to really kind of encapsulate, you know, in a closing remark or two, you know, what is your hope for what our school districts in New York will be able to do? Or if you have any final pearls of wisdom that you want to share with our audience, I'd like to give you the opportunity to do that now. So I'll just open it up perhaps to Dr. Montesano first, and then we'll sort of go around the horn here to hear from each of you.
Yeah, first off, just once again, to Mark and Darcy and the New York School Boards Association, just thank you for the opportunity to spend some time with you. And you know, the only pearls of wisdom I would say is you will never find, and this is to the superintendents as well as Board of Education, I have never found personally anything more meaningful than I have found the engagement of this district. And again, I really do compliment our Board of Education for that level of commitment. Because that in fact, in our minds, is probably the most critical challenge facing public education in America today, is in fact the ability to ensure that all of our students have the opportunity to be successful. And once again, that if you're going to engage in this work, you know, you really do have to button up your chin strap and tighten up your seatbelt, unless you're planning to get yourself involved in, you know, the superficial type of work. And I said it to you and Mark yesterday when we were just having a brief chat, that I knew in this district that we were really starting to make inroads when I started to see the level of resistance to what we were doing. Because if you're not getting resistance, more than likely you're not really making any change, you know, to what's happening. And as a white male, I can share with you that having conversations about race is very, very uncomfortable. One of the best books that we read collectively in this district was Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, that just, you know, kind of looks at the concept of race as binary, that, you know, I must be a bad person if you're calling me, you know, telling me that I have some racist tendencies, when in fact, really, we can be good people, but it just so happens we're living in a society that does have a lot of principles built on racism. And really try to build yourself a volunteer army. You know, it's really building that critical mass. This is meaningful work. Almost, in my mind, most educators will gravitate to this work because all of us want to see every child in our charge succeed. And the more these courageous conversations, in my mind, were one of the best gifts to this school district, because it enabled us to talk to one another, to get comfortable in being uncomfortable, develop vocabulary and a consistent understanding of the concepts that we're trying to look at. And the work does get easier as you kind of go forward, but it is an uncomfortable experience. And like any change, there's always going to be driving and resisting forces that you have to balance. So best wishes.
Thank you. Dr. Alston?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me and for connecting me with my colleagues who are doing amazing work in Nyack. So I've been taking notes as well, because there are people who I can connect them to. And so I just wrote down 4 things that resonate with me most coming out of this, and I'll give a resource. One is everything rises and falls on leadership. Like, that's John Maxwell's one of his very popular quotes. And for board members and superintendents, right, that's a hand-in-hand glove. And you can be the difference maker in how best positioned your community and this state ultimately is. And ultimately that can lead to the nation. So that's number one. Number two, you know, it says years ago, the phrase became very popular, all students can learn. But as it has evolved, it had become cliche. And so all students can learn, and all means all, right? Because that's the piece, right? And so the last thing is what my colleague, Dr. Montesano, said is, you know, from Kennedy, a rising tide lifts all boats. I've seen that in action in several different places across the state. So by doing this racial equity work, by identifying subgroups, ultimately what happens, you're expanding your system's ability to meet the needs of varied constituents, right? And when you do that, it lifts up everybody and then execute it, right? And so the rising tide lifts all boats. And finally, the model of educating some students will not position us, this country, this state, to be the leaders that we have been in the past and to be successful as we have been in the past. What the demands that are required for young people to be successful, whatever you want to call success, but that the ability to provide for themselves and their family to live at least a middle-class lifestyle just requires more than generations ago. And so we have the challenge, and I'm sure that the members of the New York State School Boards Association are going to step into it because we don't really have a choice, right? This will affect our grandkids, whether we like it or not. The decisions we make today will have implications down the road. So that's my closing thoughts. Thank you. The final thing is I do have a video on implicit bias done by Dr. Bryant Marks on the New York State MBK website. So if you Google NYSED, NYSED, and MBK, just click that first link and then click videos. At the very bottom, there's like an hour and 42-minute presentation, and he's a national expert who cost a certain amount if you want him in person. But we had the training, and that's on the website for anyone who wants to use that as a resource in terms of implicit bias. Like, what am I bringing to the table that I might not even know I'm bringing to the table? So that's my gift.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alston. And Karen?
Yeah, Mark, Darcy, and to NYSSBA, thank you so much for putting this together. We're very passionate about this in Nyack, so we'll talk to anybody anytime about this, right? I can't add much more than our two esteemed doctors have added here. Let me just give you the website, though. It is pisb.org, which is the organization that runs the Undoing Racism workshops for us. To fellow board members who are on this, listening in on this, and will listen to the recording, this is tough work as a board, but it's our responsibility. And as I said before, I can't say it enough, we have a moral and ethic responsibility to do this, right? We'll be failing our kids. You're failing, if you're failing some of our kids, as Dr. A says, you're failing your entire district, you're failing everybody, right? We're seeing the tide turning. It's slow, it's hard, and sometimes you wonder, will we get there? But we are. We're seeing a different reaction in teachers. We're seeing it in kids. So you will see this. Don't despair. But you've got to stick with this. You've got to educate yourselves more than anything else, and be prepared for the slum. There are so many resources out there with everything that's happened this summer and well before that. There's so much you can avail yourself of to educate yourself as a board, and I'd suggest that that's what you do. The Nyack School Board is available to anybody who wants to reach out. You can get onto our district website and reach out to any of us to discuss how we've progressed and some of the challenges. We'll be happy to do so.
Thank you, Karen. And I could not have said it better about the challenges in front of us, in front of our board members to take on this challenge, the moral imperative, the oath of office you've all taken to educate all children in your district. Dr. Alston, we raise the tide, we raise all the boats. We do need all of our kids. We do need all of them at their fullest potential if we want to stay in what I would consider the great country that we are. And I am so appreciative of all your expertise and experience that you have brought to this conversation and this dialogue with us today. New York State School Boards is here to support this effort, to support our board members and our school districts out there. We are only getting better at what we're able to do to help support this initiative, and we're going to continue to do that. You have our commitment into 2021 and beyond. So I'd like to say thank you to my colleague, Mark Schneider, who's been a wonderful architect of this webinar and the webinar that will be upcoming as well in likely February of 2021. I want to say thank you to Dr. Anael Alston, Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Access, Equity, and Community Engagement at the New York State Education Department, Dr. James Montesano, Superintendent of the Nyack Public Schools, and of course Karen Hughes, former board president, current board member of the Nyack Union Free School District Board of Education. My name is Darcy Dercoli, Director of Leadership Development here at the New York State School Boards, and we say thank you, and we are here to support, so please reach out to us if you would like to. Thank you, everyone. Have a great and wonderful day.
Thank you for watching this program produced by the New York State School Boards Association.